Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching American Revolution Part 3, Battle of Bunker Hill by Epic History. Now last time we saw as the revolution truly exploded into action with the battles of Lexington and Concord and with the meeting of the Second Continental Congress. So now the revolution is truly in motion. Today we'll see where we go from there. Now if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
April 1775. A British ship carries an urgent message across the Atlantic to the American colonies. Britain's Parliament has passed a conciliatory resolution, a last-ditch effort by Prime Minister Lord North to avert conflict with the colonies.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's coming just too late.
Now that resolution is en route to America. It is a 6-week voyage. By the time it arrives, the shooting has started at Lexington and Concord. Blood has been spilled. The war has begun.
And look, I think tensions would have continued to rise anyway, but who knows? Maybe if that had arrived a bit earlier, things might have changed. I sincerely doubt that, however.
Lord North's conciliatory resolution is met with defiance in colonial assemblies and the Continental Congress. Its terms, which do not concede Parliament's right to tax the colonies, offer far too little, too late.
That's what I'm saying, right? Even if this conciliatory resolution had arrived before violence had truly broken out, I'm not sure it would have really changed anything. Like they said, too little, too late. We've seen this sort of push and pull where Parliament will try to assert its authority, then it will pull back, but it will maintain that it has the right to do all of this. Well, that's what the colonists were angry about. Unless Parliament was going to concede that right and give them more self-governance, I think tension would continue to build and revolution would have broken out anyway.
The reply from Congress, written by Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Richard Henry Lee, is a litany of unredressed grievances.
Yeah.
The Coercive Acts, the Quebec Act, Vice Admiralty Courts, the list goes on. Negotiations are faltering.
And we're getting, by the way, some of our writers of the Revolution. Jefferson, assisted by Adams and Franklin. Got Lee there as well, but that's a pretty famous trio with those three. Of course, you're talking about writers of the Revolution, you have to mention Thomas Paine as well, maybe even someone like John Dickinson a few years earlier, but that squad right there, some pretty important voices of the Revolution, which is now kicking off.
With fatal consequences. The fighting will continue and is about to reach bloody new heights.
Oh yeah. Part 3. These fellows say we won't fight. By heaven, I hope I shall die up to my knees in blood. My goodness.
June 1775. The main British force in America is in Boston, commanded by General Thomas Gage. He has been reinforced to 6,000 regulars. But he is besieged by 15,000 New England militia. These men are highly motivated and have proven capable in combat, but they lack discipline.
Yeah, they're not the greatest trained force of all time. They're lacking a lot of discipline, especially compared to the British regulars, right? But there's a lot of them, and they are motivated. They have a cause to fight for. This is the dynamic we'll see time and time again in this conflict, where the Americans, the colonists, this is their home territory, they're familiar, they're motivated, but they do lack a lot of training and discipline. Now, there will be efforts to fix that, from Washington in particular, but still, they're not comparing to the British regulars, right, who have that incredible training, that discipline, really one of, if not the best military forces in the world at that moment. However, the thing is, for Britain, this conflict is very far away. Of course, they don't have the entire British army over in the American colonies, and so for them it's going to be a struggle to keep their men supplied, to keep these supply lines going, and to send enough troops over to actually fight against the colonists, right? And so both sides have got these different struggles, but if you're talking about how effective and well-trained these fighting forces are, then no one, or almost no one, is going to measure up to the British Army.
And ammunition. Prior to the arrival of their new commander-in-chief, George Washington, they are under the command of Artemus Ward, a sickly 47-year-old militia officer of limited experience.
Oh, great.
Nevertheless, under his...
hey, one of the great things about Washington was that he actually had experience in combat. And as we've seen, that wasn't incredibly rare. A lot of the guys who get involved in this conflict were, in one way or another, involved in the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as the American theater is sometimes referred to. So some of them have this experience, like Washington, but a lot of them don't. They were involved in that conflict in a very limited way. Maybe they weren't involved at all. There's a lot of young guys who may not have been even old enough to have been involved in the 7 Years' War. There's a combination of some experience among these rebels, and then many who have very little experience.
Direction, the militia have fortified the heights overlooking the Charlestown Peninsula. From these positions, cannon could target British ships in Boston's inner harbor. General Gage decides he must eliminate this threat and decides to seize the heights as a step to breaking the siege. It will be an opportunity not only to avenge British honour, tarnished by the shambolic retreat from Concord. As General Burgoyne points out, it will also allay any doubt
that trained troops are invincible against any numbers or any position of undisciplined rabble.
Right, and that's the attitude a lot of these Brits are coming at this conflict with. They feel like, okay, Lexington and Concord, that was a fluke, essentially. If we can get ourselves out on the field, we can prove we are far superior to this quote-unquote undisciplined rabble, right? That's the idea. Burgoyne, Gage, these guys, they want to prove that, no, they've got what it takes, and that it was a fluke at Lexington and Concord. They want to heal their bruised egos, right? And they have been bruised a little bit, because things did not really go so well for these British redcoats during that conflict. And so now is the time when they need to really prove their ability.
Gage orders Major General William Howe to make a frontal assault on Breed's Hill with 2,500 men. They are supported by naval ships, a floating battery of mortars, and cannon from Copp's Hill.
I gotta say, I love the music in this series, not to get sidetracked, but they've got the sort of era-appropriate pipes and drums, but of course they're making them into this sort of dramatic soundtrack. It really fits the theme quite well.
But the attack does not go to plan. Protected behind fences and earthworks, the undisciplined rabble pours a devastating, close-range fire into the British ranks. General Howe orders a second attack. It meets the same bloody repulse. Hundreds of regulars fall. Some British units lose half their men or more.
Damn.
Spurred on by the leadership of John Stark, James Reed, and Joseph Warren, the Patriot militia are holding their ground. But they are running out of ammunition. The chain of command has broken down amid the chaos of...
Seriously, they are literally killing so many soldiers. They are shooting so much that they are running out of ammo, right? I mean, the Brits are sending these successive waves of soldiers to try and take this position. The colonists here, they've been shooting so much, they're running out of ammunition. Gives you a sort of sense of how this battle is going.
battle. Hundreds of reinforcements mill about in confusion on Bunker Hill, while their comrades fight for their lives. When Howe launches a third attack on Breed's Hill, the militia finally break in the face of British bayonets. The Redcoats' fury as they storm the redoubt is terrible. A British lieutenant is shocked by the slaughter.
I cannot pretend to describe the horror of the scene. It was streaming with blood and strewed with dead and dying men. The soldiers stabbing some and dashing out the brains of others was a sight too dreadful for me to dwell any longer on.
The British take the heights, but are in no condition to follow up their success. In what becomes known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, they have lost 200 dead and more than 800 wounded.
Yeesh.
By contrast, Patriot casualties are around 450. But in
So this becomes known essentially as a Pyrrhic victory for the British, right? They take the position, they technically win the battle, if you count winning the battle as taking the enemy position, but they suffer these tremendous casualties doing so, right? So a Pyrrhic victory. You've won the battle, but you've in many ways lost more than your opponent has, right? And it's sort of characterized by the Brits sending these successive waves of troops. You know, they can throw men into the meat grinder. The Americans are undone by sort of their own lack of organization and their lack of ammunition, right? And I know it almost sounds a little silly, like, wow, you guys ran out of ammo, but seriously, they are not nearly as well supplied as the Redcoats. They are lacking guns and ammo and proper supplies. That's something they're gonna have to address throughout this conflict. And in this battle, they shot until they ran out of ammo, and so they had to back off. Plus that sort of lack of organization as well. There may not be an undisciplined rabble as such, but there certainly is a lack of discipline there, right? So, there's something to say about both sides, but in this battle, the British are really getting the worst of it.
include the charismatic Joseph Warren, president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. A commissioned officer who'd insisted on fighting as a private soldier, he was shot down in the redoubt during the final assault, becoming a martyr to the cause.
Yeah, one of those influential guys where you can wonder, what impact might he have had if he'd survived? We have no idea, but definitely an important loss to note in this battle.
For the Patriots, the battle, though a defeat, is a major morale boost.
Yeah.
They have stood their ground against British Redcoats and tested them to the limit.
And seriously, I mean, you had Lexington and Concord, which was in many ways a Patriot win, but what it was this British retreat that actually was pretty disorganized as well, with these Patriot, almost guerrilla fighters sort of slipping in to take pot shots at the retreating Redcoats. This is more of a regular battle, right? And so this is evidence to these Patriots, even though they lost their position, that they can do this. they can stand up to the British. They can win, especially if they can manage to train and get more supplies. They are a match for these British forces, right? So a big morale boost, as they said.
For the British, it is a lesson learned. The rebels' determination and fighting spirit must be taken seriously. As General Sir Henry Clinton remarks,
A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America.
Yeah, that's a pretty famous quote regarding this battle, right? It's a good one. It's sort of self-explanatory, right? But yeah, you can't have victories like that. If you keep winning battles like that, you're done for.
they will not make the same mistake again.
And they're sort of, I mean, the Brits are getting shocked by this revolutionary spirit the Americans have. It's in many ways reminiscent, or I suppose this came first. It's reminiscent of these early battles of the French Revolutionary Wars, where the French army, it's sort of a mess. It's disorganized, they've lost a lot of their officers, a lot of the men are new recruits who don't have training, but what they do have is revolutionary motivation, and they frankly shock their enemies in the field. Right, that's what we're getting here. These Americans don't have the training, the discipline, whatever, but they've got that motivation. Now, credit to the Brits here. They'll learn. They learn over time. They're saying, okay, we understand the situation we're in. We're going to have to take a different approach. Many of our subjects in North America, misled by dangerous and ill-designing men, have at length proceeded to open an avowed rebellion. From the king.
That summer, British authority across the 13 colonies begins to disintegrate.
Yeah. And the thing is, for the colonies, or the colonists, it's not that hard to resort to a form of independent rule, because the colonies have essentially been governing themselves from the beginning. Of course, there are exceptions to that, and there are times when the British Crown or the British Parliament took a more active role, but as we talked about in previous episodes, through salutary neglect, the colonies were basically left to their own devices. And so, a lot of them have, in fact, they have their own assemblies, right? And these are pretty powerful assemblies that have been governing these colonies. There's some particularly prominent assemblies, say in Massachusetts or Virginia, but each of these colonies has the same thing going, where they have a pretty high degree of self-governance. And so when it comes time for war, they don't need to build these institutions anew. They can run with what they already have. And of course, a lot of these colonial institutions will essentially continue into the Republican era, just in a different form or altered slightly, right? So it's interesting for a revolution where, in many ways, you're fighting a revolution to just keep what you already had, I mean, you can compare this to something, say, like the Haitian Revolution, right? Where these enslaved Haitians, they're rising up to completely shake up the political and social order. They need to build institutions anew. They need to find leadership. Everything is getting shaken up. Whereas here, a lot of these colonists, like I said, they're fighting a revolution to, of course, throw off the tyranny they see coming from the British government. But what they want is essentially independent rule in a way that they've already sort of had. Right, and they have these pre-existing institutions. So it's an interesting revolution, different than many others we see throughout history.
The governors of North and South Carolina, Virginia, New York, and New Hampshire have all been forced to flee their homes. Others resign, while in Connecticut, John Trumbull sides with the Patriots.
Oh, wow.
Only in New Jersey and Georgia do British-appointed governors retain any control.
Goddamn New Jersey.
The British have barely any troops in America outside of Boston. A fact which is underscored when frontiersman Ethan Allen leads a band of New Hampshire militia to storm Fort Ticonderoga, held by a skeleton force of just 48 redcoats.
Right. The fort does not have a massive garrison, and once again, this is the type of guerrilla or, non-traditional warfare we see in this conflict, where you have militia bands under guys like Ethan Allen who are like, you know what, let's take some independent action. Let's go take the fort. The Brits are like, sorry, what is happening?
The so-called Gibraltar of North America falls without a shot fired, and the rebels seize 59 heavy guns from its arsenal.
And a lot of these forts that the rebels are going to take during this conflict were forts that the British had taken from the French during the 7 Years' War not that long ago.
Yet even now, there are those on both sides who seek a peaceful way out of the crisis.
Yeah?
Moderates, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, believe the colonies are too divided among themselves to survive without British protection.
Yeah, John Dickinson, probably one of the more famous writers of the Revolution. He's an interesting guy. He is one of these sort of moderates of the Revolution, a moderate revolutionary. He's someone who becomes really famous due to his letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, I believe they were called, or a farmer in Pennsylvania. You get the idea, which are a series of essays he writes during the lead up to all of this, where he's essentially protesting British abuses of the colonists, right? So in that way, he's opposed to this governance that's been happening, but he's also somebody who is not necessarily an advocate for full independence, right? He's a little worried. He would rather reconciliation with the British government. Maybe they could work something out where the colonies get more independence, more autonomy, and they get their liberties as Englishmen respected, but they don't have to go fully independent, right? Now, Dickinson is someone who also fights in this war, so he ends up committed to the conflict, but he is one of these moderate figures. And of course, there are plenty of those on the British side of the conflict. There are plenty of members of parliament who, well, some of them are straight up sympathetic towards the Patriots. They sort of tacitly or sometimes openly side with them. But even you've got more members of parliament who are thinking, this might not be worth the effort. Why are we doing all of this? They think the Patriots had legitimate issues, so you've got these types of figures on both sides. And Dickinson, he's one of these guys that is in some ways gotten sort of forgotten in the aftermath of this revolution. I mean, there are other members of the Congress at this time who have been more forgotten, but he's someone who was really prominent sort of during and prior to this point. And I think because of his moderate attitude, his reputation sort of fell a bit over time, and he's not remembered today alongside some of the more famous figures we'll see in these videos.
He foresees
a multitude of commonwealths, crimes, and calamities, centuries of mutual jealousies, hatreds, wars of devastation, till at last the exhausted provinces shall sink into slavery under the yoke of some fortunate conqueror.
some cling to a belief that King George III is sympathetic to their cause, but has been led astray by his dishonest and corrupt ministers.
Right, and this is a classic trope, right? When you're someone who is upset with the government, really throughout this time period in medieval into early modern Europe, well, you couldn't possibly blame the king, the great and generous king, who you may or may not believe was literally appointed by God. Now, most of these colonists don't, but this is a larger trend than just what we see here. And so what you'll see is oftentimes people will blame the king's malevolent ministers. They'll say, well, of course the king himself is fantastic, but it's his ministers around him who have so evilly misled him. Now, of course, this is often ridiculous. As we know here, King George III was not a friend to the American colonies. He was pissed off, right? And so this is really a delusion in many ways, but it's a delusion, a trope we see, as I said many times, in countries with a monarchy. People don't want to blame the king, even when it is the king's fault, or in part the king's fault. in terms of this war being waged against the American colonists as being prosecuted by both the king and parliament.
In July, at Dickinson's urging, the Second Continental Congress sends a new petition to the king.
The Olive Branch Petition.
We solemnly assure your majesty that we most ardently desire the former harmony between Great Britain and these colonies may be restored. Your majesty's ministers, persevering in their measures and proceeding to open hostilities for enforcing them, have compelled us to arm in our own defense. We therefore beseech your majesty.
And at this point, this really is delusion, I mean, there was a point maybe reconciliation could have been achieved, but in this moment, we talked in previous episodes how the idea of open war or independence was an extremely radical idea, but it's becoming less and less radical by the day. It's becoming more and more normal, and something like this is becoming more and more out of step, right? It's becoming really clear that there is not going to be reconciliation between the colonies and their mother country, and it's pretty clear to a lot of people that the king is not some magnanimous figure who doesn't know what's happening. He's part of this.
To settle peace through every part of your dominions, with all humility, submitting to your majesty's wise consideration.
It becomes known as the Olive Branch Petition. But it is beaten to London by news and maimed British soldiers from Bunker Hill. In August, George III declares his American colonies to be in open rebellion. The British Empire begins to assemble its might to reclaim the colonies by force.
Uh-oh, now we're in trouble. His Excellency, General George Washington, has arrived amongst us, universally admired. Joy is visible on every countenance. From Nathaniel Greene, Washington's number 2.
On the 2nd of July, 1775, General George Washington arrives outside Boston to take command of the newly christened Continental Army. Until recently, he'd been living a relatively quiet life as a Virginia plantation owner and local representative.
Yeah, Washington. Now look, and I talked about this last time, I'm not going to say he was a man with no ambition. It's clear he was angling for this position to be commander-in-chief in a way that I think he really was not angling for the position of president. I think he rather would have gone home. I think the sort of idea of Washington, a man who would have rather been at home farming, or telling his slaves to farm, than actually out doing public business, is one that's relatively accurate. This really is someone who, I think, like I said, he wanted this position, but a lot of the things he was made to do in public life, he would rather have not been involved in.
But his military experience, from the French and Indian War, serving as a lieutenant colonel of militia, exceeds that of nearly any other American-born officer.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. They had some people with experience, but Washington, he really was pretty up there in terms of who you could choose from. That, alongside his personality, his position, his family, his prominence, all of these made him a pretty obvious choice for this position.
Through an advantageous marriage to Martha Custis, he is also one of the richest men in America.
Oh yeah.
With a natural air of authority. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a congressional delegate from Pennsylvania, observes,
"He has so much martial dignity in his deportment that you would distinguish him to be a general and a soldier from among 10,000 people."
Yeah, and Washington, I've said this before, and I'll probably say it again throughout this series, he was not the most incredible general of all time, right? There are many who were far, far better than him. But what is really exceptional about him were the qualities of leadership that you could find within his character. He was someone who was generally sort of relatively soft spoken, who could often be sort of unassuming in action and word, but whose presence was immediately felt, right? He was someone who, when he entered a room, people looked to him. He had aura, as the kids say today. He had aura. No, that's not where I was going. But he did have sort of this aura of leadership in a way, right? He was this very natural type of leader. And, he was someone who could really encourage people, inspire them. Everyone wanted to be, acknowledged by George Washington. And so he was someone who really was an incredible leader, both in the good and the bad times, and that's what set him apart from everybody else, not necessarily his skill as a general.
On arrival, Washington discovers the Continental Army to be in a deplorable state.
He was also really tall. Not to, get off topic. He was really tall and really strong. That's something that people around him always noted, right? So along with just his character, he was a very physically impressive man as well.
Many soldiers lack proper muskets, and ammunition remains in critically short supply. There are few cannon, or even uniforms. Supply and logistics are in shambles.
Yeah.
Discipline is virtually non-existent. The camp is a jumble of tents, ill-placed latrines, and unfinished earthworks.
And this is something that I mentioned earlier, Washington is going to have to address throughout the course of the war. But, all these colonial soldiers, they're just guys. They're just dudes, right? We talked about how little experience many of them had. They don't know what they're doing. And they are now in a fight against perhaps the most professionalized army in the world. Maybe Britain's competing with Prussia for that, but Britain's definitely up there right at the top.
Officers fraternize with their men, who simply come and go as they please. Washington is aghast, but immediately gets to work. Officers are given sashes or cockades to distinguish them from their men.
Revolutionaries really love a good cockade, huh? We see that with the French revolutionaries as well.
Severe punishments are introduced for desertion, fighting, and even swearing. Crucially, Washington orders his men be inoculated for smallpox, which has erupted across Massachusetts.
Yeah, it sort of seems like it comes out of nowhere, but a pretty big moment, right? Inoculation was a pretty new idea at that moment. It was something that was still sort of catching on. A lot of people were skeptical. This was a pretty big moment in getting some people to accept inoculation more broadly. There's an instance of, I believe, Catherine the Great in Russia getting herself and her family inoculated against smallpox. It was big in convincing a lot of people, both in that country and educated people generally, that was the right way to go, right? So it's sort of interesting new science here, essentially, medical treatment.
This practice, also used by the British, may have saved his army from destruction. The Continental Congress has appointed several generals to serve under Washington's overall command, for a mix of practical, military, and political reasons. Some will win fame, others infamy, in the years ahead.
Yep. Hey!
Nathaniel Greene, a young Rhode Island Quaker, who's educated himself in the art of war. He will become a close friend of Washington and his most able commander.
As I said, in this war, he's really Washington's number two. I think someone who often gets greatly underestimated. He's a really important figure in this conflict, a very competent military leader.
Charles Lee, an irascible and arrogant career soldier, disillusioned with the mother country. He is arguably the most experienced officer in the colonies, and Washington's second in command.
Yeah, Charles Lee. good example of the fact that experience isn't everything. Look, I'm a big advocate for experience, but, look, we've seen Nathaniel Greene, Charles Lee. We'll find out through the course of these videos who ends up being more accomplished.
Israel Putnam, a veteran soldier from Connecticut, nicknamed Old Put. He served with distinction in the French and Indian War, and more recently at Bunker Hill. John Sullivan, an aggressive New Hampshire officer who had previously served in the Continental Congress. Horatio Gates, another disillusioned British officer, capable but privately contemptuous of Washington. These men and their officers must now pull together an unruly army summoned from across the colonies. From independent-minded New Englanders to equally stubborn riflemen from Virginia and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and this is quite the task. You know, I talked about how, for a lot of these colonies, they had institutions of governance already. And so they just continue those institutions, those assemblies. With the military, that's a different situation. Now, yes, these colonies have militias, but what they're building here is something entirely new, right? This Continental Army, this is where, in many ways, they're starting from scratch, or at least close to scratch, right? They have to build up this entirely new fighting force, and it's going to be difficult, right? There are going to be a lot of challenges bringing together these scattered rebel forces from these different colonies who are very different, wanted to do things very differently. It's going to be quite the challenge to bring them all together in one fighting force.
Each man with more instinctive loyalty to his colony than to any shared cause. However, Washington's greatest concern is a lack of gunpowder.
Yep.
By one estimate, there's enough for each man to fire just 9 rounds. This, together with the challenges of supply and discipline, means he can do little more than hold the fortifications around Boston.
I mean, we literally saw earlier with Bunker Hill, they ran out of ammunition, that they don't have the supplies, right? You know, it's like, oh, what, you lost the battle because you ran out of bullets? Yeah, that's the issue that the rebels are dealing with here. They literally do not have the gunpowder to fight, even if they wanted to.
Fortunately for the Continental Army, the British have problems of their own. Boston is riddled with smallpox. Most British soldiers have been inoculated or exposed to the disease, though some still fall sick. Bostonians themselves suffer much more greatly. Of greater concern, now they are bottled up in Boston, is that British supply lines now stretch more than 3,000 miles back across the Atlantic to Britain.
Yeah.
British ships are now vulnerable to American privateers and the first vessels of a fledgling continental navy.
Yeah, I mean, look, the British Navy is supreme, but doesn't change the fact they've got 3,000 miles to cover to keep themselves supplied. I can tell you, as someone who's flown back and forth from Britain to America many times, that's a long flight. That'd be hard to keep an army supplied today. Back in the 1700s, that's an extremely tall order.
The supply situation in Boston becomes critical, with starvation a growing fear. That the British find themselves in this predicament is widely blamed on General Gage's leadership. He is recalled to London, and command passes to General William Howe. But under the present circumstances, there is little he can do to change British fortunes.
Keep an eye on this trend. Over the course of the war, we'll see the British swapping out leaders, swapping out strategies. They can never really find anything consistent that works for them. If If that man is not crushed before spring, he will become the most formidable enemy America has. Washington about Dunmore.
As the siege of Boston drags on, in Virginia, Governor Lord Dunmore holes up in Norfolk, under the protection of Royal Navy warships. From here, he comes up with a plan to crush the rebellion in Virginia. Across the southern colonies, roughly half the population are enslaved black men, women, and children.
Yeah, and we talked about these percentages previously. I mean, you can see, there was slavery in all these colonies. We've got here, there's sometimes an idea that the North was entirely slave-free. Not true, though, of course, a lot of these colonies and then states would outlaw slavery not too long after this. But even if you just look at them now, the percentage of the population that is enslaved is insanely disproportionate down in the South. You can see, it's especially bad in South Carolina and Georgia. 45 and 60% of your population is enslaved. But really the big issue here is going to be Virginia. And that's because Virginia is one of the most important colonies throughout the 13 colonies. They're very influential. They've got a big population. We can see here our two biggest colonies by population, I believe, our biggest three. Massachusetts, 230,000 free, about 5,000 enslaved. You've got Pennsylvania, shout out, 230,000 free, 5,000 enslaved, about the same amount. And then you've got Virginia, about 260,000 free, 187,000 enslaved. Look at that. Look how much bigger their population is compared to any of these other colonies. So it's going to become a particular issue that so much of their population is enslaved, and the British are going to look for a way to use that to their advantage.
Most work on plantations, where they are treated with appalling brutality. As a result, the white population's greatest fear is a mass slave revolt.
Yes, they were absolutely terrified of slave revolt. There's a reason that so many whiteys, so many whites were so hostile to the Haitian Revolution, especially in the American South, right? When that happens, they look at it and they see sort of a portent of their own future. They are deathly afraid that something like the Haitian Revolution could happen in what are states at that point, right? And even at this point, of course, this is years before the Haitian Revolution, but they are still extremely afraid of slave uprisings. Of course, there have been slave uprisings, slave resistance. These white slave owners and just white people generally, they're extremely fearful of this happening. And obviously, for good reason, you saw those states, 40% of your population, 60% of your population are enslaved people who are, first of all, deprived of their freedom, kept in horrific conditions. It's like, yeah, you're afraid that they're going to rise up and kill the people who are owning and abusing them.
In November 1775, Lord Dunmore attempts to turn this fear into reality.
He does.
I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard, or be looked upon as traitors. And I do hereby farther declare all indented servants, Negroes, or others, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be.
It is a direct appeal to Virginia's slaves. Freedom for those who take up arms against their rebel masters. Nothing could be more incendiary.
Yeah, so Dunmore's proclamation, this is something that's become a bigger part of the narrative of the American Revolution in recent years, right? It's this really fascinating moment where the Scottish governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, says, if you are the slave of a patriot master, you come and fight with us, the British, then you will earn your freedom. Right? So it's this interesting thing for a couple of different reasons. One is that, as they're putting out, it was extremely incendiary to the southern slave owners, right? And this is really one of the things that pushes them even deeper into rebellion or revolution, right? I mean, the American Revolution is a complicated event. There are many different reasons why many different people got involved, found themselves as patriots. Slavery was, of course, not the only reason, or I would argue even the biggest reason. But for some of these southern slave owners, when they see this as a threat against them to lose their slaves, and not only that, but to have them rise up in rebellion. And so they are outraged, and so some who were already patriots become even more ardent patriots, and many who were on the fence beforehand, they join up with the patriots, right? These southern slave owners, they become revolutionaries. So it's really big for that. It's interesting, I think, honestly, the sort of idea of this had a bigger impact than the proclamation itself. In the end, there are not an incredibly large amount of slaves that actually join up with Dunmore. And in fact, there will be another proclamation, I believe in 1779, that will sort of expand this throughout the colonies. And then you'll see more slaves and black loyalists joining up. In this moment, the actual impact is not massive, but the impact in terms of swaying these southern slave owners, that is pretty influential. Now, sometimes this is framed as some sort of humanitarian action, but if you pay attention, you'll notice Dunmore did not free every slave in Virginia. What he did was he freed slaves who had patriot masters who were willing to join with the British, right? So if you were British or a loyalist and you had slaves, you could keep your slaves, right? There was no freeing of slaves in that instance, right? And of course, those enslaved people who joined up with the British, things don't really go super well for them. In part, of course, because the Patriots win the war, even those, and so a lot of them, don't really have anywhere to go. They've joined the losing side. Some of these enslaved people, or formerly enslaved people, they're sort of taken, and they are sort of able to leave the colonies through British support. A couple thousand of them are taken up to Nova Scotia, and then some of those are sent to Sierra Leone in Africa through this sort of project some British abolitionists were doing, where they were sending black people to Africa to try and settle them there, to get them out of Canada or Britain or whatever. A lot of these enslaved people, they do not see justice in the end, whether from the Americans or the British. But this is this very interesting moment in the conflict.
Few patriots consider the cause of liberty to extend to enslaved black Americans.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, a lot of these patriots at the time, they're writing always about how they're being enslaved by the British, or I should say the British Parliament. They're outraged, blah, blah, blah. But, many of them own slaves. Many of them support the institution of slavery. There's the occasional person who steps out of that. Some Northerners, some Quakers in particular, were anti-slavery. There are definitely examples. We talked about someone like a John Dickinson earlier. He was someone who was sort of lukewarm, I guess, on slavery. He owned slaves, but then he voluntarily freed them during his lifetime. So you have guys like that who were sort of complicated. Like I said, some, especially some Quakers, who were directly opposed to slavery. But there are a lot of these revolutionary leaders, a Washington or a Jefferson or a Madison, some of your most famous guys, who speak very strongly in terms of liberty and freedom, but they really mean it to mostly apply to white men, oftentimes white property-owning men. They do not extend that to the enslaved people. But I think that's something that is pretty well understood at this point.
And in the South, Dunmore's proclamation threatens the destruction of the entire economy and society itself.
Oh yeah.
Without irony, patriots condemn Dunmore's promise of freedom as a violation of all law, justice, and humanity.
And when we're talking about these revolutionary leaders down south, most of, In fact, a vast majority of the most prominent leaders of the South are planters. They're slave owners, right? So that's who we're talking about here. But sometimes people will be surprised and sort of ask the question, well, the percentage of people who owned slaves down south was actually not that high. So why did you have this vast majority of Southern whites who didn't own slaves, but who essentially supported the institution of slavery? And there are many reasons for that, but one, as they pointed out, is that, slavery, it wasn't just essential to the economy of these colonies. The whole society was built around slavery and the hierarchy of white supremacy. Whether you were a slave owner or not, that was essential to your life. And for many of the sort of yeomen, the poor whites who maybe owned some of their own property, at least for them, they saw themselves as not at the bottom of the hierarchy because down below them were free black people and enslaved people, right? And so there was, in some ways, this sort of race unity against the bottom of the social hierarchy, even though, in many ways, the interests of these white farmers, small-holding farmers, and the white planters really didn't align in many ways. But through this institution of white supremacy, their interests were sort of brought together. Right? This was a complicated thing. But what we're talking about here are mainly the planter elite of these colonies who, of course, did own slaves.
Washington, he is the arch traitor to the rights of humanity. Within a month, 300 escaped slaves have reached Dunmore's base in Norfolk, where they form the new Royal Ethiopian Regiment. Thousands more will seek freedom behind the British lines before the war is over.
Yes, though, like I said, I think a large part of that is due to this later proclamation, which sort of builds on Dunmore's proclamation and expands it.
The price of Dunmore's proclamation is to turn southern landowners into mortal enemies of the British cause.
That's exactly right.
Norfolk is a loyalist stronghold, but unable to secure supplies for his forces, Dunmore decides to abandon it. In the process, on New Year's Day 1776, Norfolk burns to the ground. Both sides blame the other.
Classic.
It is the largest, but not the last, settlement to be destroyed in the war.
I pity our good general who has had a greater burden on his shoulders and more difficulties to struggle with than I think should fall to the share of so good a man. James Warren to John Adams.
That winter, the standoff continues at Boston, with conditions deteriorating for both sides. Life in the American camp is miserable.
We have suffered prodigiously for want of wood. Many regiments have been obliged to eat their provisions raw for want of firing to cook. And notwithstanding, we have burned up all the fences and cut down all the trees for a mile around the camp. Our suffering has been inconceivable.
And of course, this will not be the last tough winter for the Patriots. In fact, they've got a couple more to follow, so things are not going super great.
The only good news comes at sea, where American privateers continue to intercept British ships carrying food and supplies. On the 29th of November, they score their biggest prize yet, the brig Nancy, carrying 2,000 muskets and ammunition.
Hey.
But Washington faces another looming crisis. Most of his men have signed up to fight only until the end of 1775. And given the conditions, few plan to stay any longer. December brings heavy snow and the expiry of the first enlistments. Despite the pleading, threats, and curses of their officers, almost half of Washington's men pack up and march for home. They take with them not only their muskets and equipment, but their hard-won experience.
Yeah, not great when you're trying to fight a war and that much of your army leaves you.
Washington is distraught. By January 1776, his force has been reduced to less than half its summer peak. There are now just 9,000 men under his command.
Yeah, it's the tough winter. You know, they've seen, of course, some combat, but really not too much fighting over this period of time. They sort of got the British hemmed in there. So all they're doing are facing these dire conditions while these guys have got families at home, you know, back in the homestead. So when these guys' times are up, they're thinking, well, I might as well go home, tend to my family, you know? I've got affairs back home. Most of these guys are farmers, of course. Not all. I mean, a lot of them might be more town-dwelling individuals as well, not to generalize. But basically, they've got things to do. Life is already rough. They don't need to be out here. Yeah, they probably won't be.
But General Howe's forces are not in much better shape. The British are even considering evacuating Boston. Then, later that month, shocking news arrives in the American camp, carried in pamphlets and letters. King George III has addressed Parliament on the subject of America. From the King's own lips, the Patriots hear their cause condemned as a desperate conspiracy, whose ideas are repugnant to the true constitution of the colonies. He lays all blame for the conflict on the Americans. He promises an overwhelming military response. In that moment, the Patriots' last lingering hopes of reconciliation die.
Yeah, and most of them had given up already, but if you're a more moderate John Dickinson type, you know, you push for this olive branch petition, even though it's pretty clear the king is not thrilled with all of this. Well, now you have his words exactly. And not only has he come out against the revolution, but very strongly denouncing it in very fierce language and putting all blame on the American colonists and promising this overwhelming military response. If you're one of these moderates, it's exactly the opposite of what you wanted to hear. And if you're a radical, it's everything you suspected, right? This is everything you thought the king would say, and now he said it. You're ready for continued war.
To Americans like General Nathaniel Greene, it's nothing short of betrayal.
Heaven hath decreed that tottering empire Britain to irretrievable ruin. And thanks to God, since Providence hath so determined, America must raise an empire of permanent duration, supported upon the grand pillars of truth, freedom, and religion, encouraged by the smiles of justice, and defended by her own patriotic sons.
For Washington, it's the final nail in the coffin of relations with Great Britain.
We are determined to shake off all connections with a state so unjust and unnatural. This I would tell them, not under covert, but in words as clear as the sun in its meridian brightness.
Well, there you go. Pretty clear.
Until now, many patriots have shied away from calls for independence. But the mood has changed.
Right, as I said, it's becoming more and more normalized. An idea that was once extremely radical is now becoming the main option, really. I mean, we're in this situation where we're in open rebellion. We are at war with our mother country. We've tried to reach out several times with an olive branch. It hasn't worked. The king has essentially declared war on us. Now what do? There is no reconciliation. You either give up or you fight. And what are you fighting for? You're fighting for independence.
The King's open hostility, the provocations of Lord Dunmore, the blood shed at Bunker Hill. Only a full break from Britain will answer. But Britain is preparing to fight back.
Uh-oh.
Do you enjoy epic history videos and want to support our work? Then make sure you check out our Patreon page for new episodes, production updates, and exclusive perks.
What an episode. So I'll link their video down below, so you should go and check it out, give them a like, show them support for making these fantastic videos. I've got my Patreon linked down below as well, which will give you access to exclusive reaction videos, by the way. So that was a good one, I mean, y'all know I love epic history. Really, every series they've done has been fantastic. They've got their Rise of China series going on right now. That one's incredible. Their American Revolution series, I mean, they just do a great job with every topic they handle. This one is no exception. Some exciting stuff. I mean, we are now fully in the swing of the American Revolution. All chance at reconciliation has been ended. And so here we go. Now we see how the war itself plays out in full force. Some fascinating stuff. I always enjoy talking about this topic, the political stuff in particular. I think it's really fascinating. I mean, of course, there is grand historical debate among both sort of regular people and academic historians today over the causes of the American Revolution. What does it really mean? What does it signify to us today? Why did it happen? I mean, all these types of things. There is a lot of debate over all of these. I think it happened for a couple of different reasons, but it's a really deep topic. There's a mountain of academic literature on the topic. It's some interesting stuff. So if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and once again, check out that Patreon linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.